Hello and welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today I'm delighted to welcome back, even if it's just virtually, one of my favorite authors, Sherry Thomas, whose new book, oh, you're welcome, A Tempest at Sea, is just out. It's part of her Lady Sherlock series. Before we begin, I'd like to let those tuning in know that the Poison Pen does have copies of A Tempest at Sea, as well as the earlier books in the series, and we would be delighted to hold one or more for you or put them in the mail. Just give us a call or go online to the Poison Pen Bookstore and we can connect you with this truly fabulous series of books. Now I'd like to welcome Sherry.
Thank you, John. Lovely to see you again, as always.
It's wonderful to see you. I always like to start with authors by having them tell us a little bit about themselves before they became a writer, and you have kind of a fascinating life story.
If by fascinating you mean I was an immigrant.
Well, yes, and you
it always
learned.
it always sounded a little bit boring to me because I was like, wait, what's so fascinating about my life? Yes, and what were you saying?
Yeah, and you also English was not your first language, if I remember correctly.
You do remember correctly. I think you might hear it also. English is not my first language. And yeah, perhaps the fascinating part was that I learned English when I was a romance writer exclusively. I used to say I learned English reading romance. And a lot of that was true. But I also learned it reading a lot of science fiction when I was a teenager. So I learned English by reading romance and science fiction. And as a result, not so much the science fiction part, but as a result of reading a lot of historical romance as a teenager, by the time I reached adulthood, I had like the vocabulary of a Victorian old lady. Because remember, I didn't spend my childhood here, so like there was a lot of like I didn't ever watch Sesame Street until I had children of my own, and so a lot of children's vocabulary was kind of just missing from my vocabulary.
You were a very advanced child, I guess we'll say.
I guess.
So did you always want to be a writer, or what were your initial plans when you were growing up in terms of careers?
I did think about writing because I love reading and I found stories fascinating. So I think, like most people who eventually became writers, I tried my hand at it when I was, I don't know, around preteen age. And I immediately found out it was much more difficult than I thought. Like I would have this great idea, like, 5 teenagers go off in space, and like they each perform something. One even does a gymnastic routine in space, and then I just didn't know what to do anymore. Like, what else were they going to do in space? No idea. All set up and no story. So after a couple of such attempts, I was like, oh, I guess this is not for me. Then I very quickly decided that and went on doing whatever teenagers are supposed to do. And eventually I thought I would study international trade and finance because I wanted to go to schools that dealt with international relations, because I did speak 2 languages, and I thought, let me take advantage of that. But life intervened. Instead of going to grad school, I became a stay-at-home mom at a very young age. And one day I read a romance that disagreed with me rather violently. And I suddenly thought, I should do this. I should sit at home, write a romance, make some money from it. And, might be interesting because I was 23. I didn't know what to do with my life. And I thought it was as good as any. And every time I look back on it, the older I get, the more astonished I am that this was how my life changed. Like it was like a huge turning point in my life, and I didn't even know it. And I started writing, and then quickly realized, yes, I was right the first time. It's much harder to write than it is to think about writing. And it took me 8 years before, this was back in the Jurassic era and Jurassic age. So it took me 8 years before New York offered me a contract. And I guess since then, I've always had a traditional publishing contract and have always just continued to write.
And that first book was a private arrangement that was
That
published?
first book was private arrangement. It was the first manuscript I wrote, but it wasn't published until 6 years later when I rewrote it from top to bottom.
Good heavens. Even back then, when you were writing historical romance, it might be my perception, but you were kind of pushing at the boundaries of the genre, because that first book was not your typical historical romance.
Uh, I attribute it all to blissful ignorance. I didn't know I was doing stuff I wasn't supposed to do. Like that first book had a dual timeline. I did not realize this was uncommon in romance because I saw it everywhere else. So I was like, yeah, what am I gonna do with this gigantic backstory from the first draft? Yeah, I just did that, and they took it. And I didn't know it was unusual until the book came out. And then readers were saying, like, this is weird.
Weird but wonderful, I think, was many of the comments that I heard. So you proceeded to write a number of historical romances and some young adult novels. What prompted you to start the Lady Sherlock series?
I read Sherlock Holmes when I was a kid and enjoyed it like everybody else did. And I read in Chinese, actually, translated into Chinese. But it was I think in 2006 when I first came across the Mary Russell Sherlock Holmes books by Laurie R. King, which is Sherlock Holmes prestige, like Sherlock Holmes written by other people. That I suddenly thought, like my eyes really opened at that first book, and I was like, wow, you could write it like this, and it was just so cool and so fascinating. And I was like, I would love to do something like this, but I didn't think I could do it. I didn't consider myself a strong plotter at that stage of my writing life, and also I just sold in romance. And although I didn't know that much about romance, I knew enough that if you sold in something, you should continue in for a while. That's a way to build a career. So I was like, oh, let me hang on to this idea for a while. And by the time the Benedict Cumberbatch version of Sherlock was airing on public television, that was when I thought to myself, okay, maybe I could try it. It was 6 or 7 years later, and I was kind of running out of ideas for historical romance, and I thought, why not? Let's see if I could do this.
Tell us a little bit about the series, because you kind of flip the gender switch on Sherlock and make him a female. But who are some of the primary characters readers encounter?
Readers, of course, encounter Sherlock Holmes, the titular Lady Sherlock. This is a gender bent telling of Sherlock Holmes. And there is Mrs. Watson. Instead of Dr. Watson, there's Mrs. Watson, widow of Dr. Watson. In the original canon, the woman Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson married, basically never showed her face again after her love story with Dr. Watson. But this Mrs. Watson had led quite a life. She's 11 years older than her late husband, and had been an actress on stage, which in the Victorian era was, something like kind of like, yeah, it's rather scandalous. And so she has basically been like both a supporter and a mentor to Sherlock Holmes. It was she who first saw Charlotte's talents and it's like, you should hand out your shingles and make money off this, monetize your talents. And there's also Charlotte's sister, Livia. And I felt that you can't just take the male character and just flip that character into female without like some sort of repercussions, especially in the Victorian era when men and women were supposed to lead completely different lives. And a man would have had a lot more freedom and a lot less concerns about what kind of person or lives he was supposed to lead. And a woman would have had many more obstacles placed in her way and many fewer opportunities and many more restrictions. And so I sort of wanted Charlotte to reflect that. And I also wanted her to be a little more human than the typical Sherlock Holmes character. I wanted her to And the way I thought about humanizing her was to give her a sister to whom she, she's very close. The sister kind of like half raised her in a sense because they have very absent and inattentive parents. And I want the sister to be a very normal person who has all the usual anxieties and, who has who's very sensitive to what society expects of her, and who's very keenly aware that who she is really inside does not, jive with that at all. And she's anxious and concerned about all that. Whereas Charlotte is completely immune to both public opinion and peer pressure and all those other things. So I want them to have grown up together, for them to have influenced each other, and to have, for Livia to have this rock in Charlotte, and for Charlotte to have learned a bit about humanity via Livia. And of course, there's the love interest, whose initials are IA. Yes, it was deliberately made that way. And that will be Lord Ingram, Charlotte's friend from late childhood, early adolescence onward. And they have a rather complicated history, but they are also like sincerely very good friends who care a lot about each other.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us to the latest installment in your series, A Tempest at Sea. It kind of picks up with the premise that everyone thinks Charlotte is no more. That she's
right. At the end of book 6, she faked her own death to kind of get out from Moriarty, to kind of get away from Moriarty's attention.
And now she's doing some work for the government, and you sent her off to sea. What can you tell us about that installment?
It was a terrible idea. That's all I can tell you. I often start these books with just like, oh, maybe a heist, or maybe somebody comes and there's this trouble, and this time I was like, what if they are on the ship? Because everybody loves Murder on the Nile. Is it Murder on the Nile or Death on the Nile? Death on the Nile. Yeah. Everybody loves that story. Everybody like kind of a lock room mystery, and I was like, a ship is perfect. Mm-hmm. And then I would go on to have so much trouble with this gosh darn ship. Because what happens was that my stories are already set in a particular time. They're set in the late 1880s. And I know a lot about ships in the 1890s. And you can also find a lot of information about the ships in the 1860s and even up to 1870. But in the 1880s, there seems to be this whole giant vacuna in like maritime, history, at least like in what you can dig up online. So basically, in the end, I had to design my own ship. I was hoping to find a ready-made
example,
some ready-made naval architecture. But in the end, I had to design my own ship, taking what I know about ships from earlier era and what I know about ships from later era, and like reading newspaper articles about various ships of that time. So yeah, that took a while. For the longest time, I was writing without knowing how things were situated on the ship, like who is where exactly. And in a normal mystery, that doesn't really matter too much. You just need to know where the murder site is and how that was laid out. But in a story like this, you have to know exactly where everyone is on the ship and in relation to each other. And you have to basically know exactly where everyone was, like during the time frame of the murder. And all those things I find excruciating. I have like a hatred of timeline for some reason. I don't like to nail down timeline until the last minute. Mm-hmm. So, oh my goodness, when I finally had to nail down that timeline, it was like, hair pulling out time. How can I make everything fit this timeline? Or how can I make this timeline work to fit everything else? So yes, it was a terrible idea, but it turned out I like the book a lot. Yeah. When it was all said and done.
You even include kind of plans of the ship at the beginning of the book, so
it does
exactly where things are. Right. Yeah, I think your natural skill as a writer is characterization. I think plotting is probably not something you gravitate towards, so this was probably a challenge because it is definitely a very intricate kind of who's where, when, why, what, and with what weapon kind of thing.
Right, exactly. And it's more like I came to plotting later in life. So it's always like, oh gosh, gotta plot now.
You mentioned some of the research you did on the ships, and I think what's fascinating about the Lady Sherlock series is the setting for it, the Victorian era, and how you kind of break up some misperceptions some people might have who are not familiar about the Victorian era. There's this idea that it's very staid and that men were men and women were women, and there was no deviations, and that it was just, I guess, as opposed to the Regency period, very dull and staid and structured. But you show that people really did live lives that were not the norm in your female characters.
Oh
You showed
yeah.
that it was a time of innovation, of scientific discovery. It was not just this kind of blip in history.
I feel like, I don't know, maybe the mid-Victorian era might have been like, but not very familiar, but the late Victorian era, I feel like it's very much analogous to like, our turn of the century, contemporary world in the sense that it was a really dynamic time, and technology were coming along like super fast and super like basically they were being fire hose with new technology, just as we are right now, because by the late Victorian era they had telephone, they had telegraph, which means like telegraph was called the Victorian internet. News from anywhere in the world can reach back to the UK in about 24 hours or less. And if you compare that to the beginning of the century, or even to the beginning of Victoria's reign, it's like day and night difference. And by that time, you could cross the Atlantic Ocean in 6 or 7 days. You could go, around the world in 80 days was written like even like, I think at least 10 years before the era in which I'm writing. And so they already had the first women doctors. There were actually even like whole hospitals. They were close to having whole hospitals staffed by women. So women could go to medical school. They didn't have lawyers yet, but that was on the way. And there was the suffragist movement. So it was like a time of basically like dynamic technological and social changes. So lots of things were happening, and it was like, it's a really exciting time, just like it is now. But I think we look back and go, wow, still in some ways can't believe how old-fashioned they were, which I believe when people look back on us 100 years from now, they were going to say exactly the same thing.
That's true. Another thing that's wonderful about the books is how you slip all these little tidbits of historical research that you found into the storyline. You had mentioned ships, and I think there's a reference to the Great Eastern, if I'm remember
Right,
correctly.
right. Yeah.
And I think I had to look it up because I thought, is that something you made up, or is that a real fact? And it's a real
No,
fact, and
I
it's
was
just
I was
fascinating.
astonished at how gigantic the Great Eastern was. It was like unbelievable.
Did that inspire your HMS Provence?
That did not inspire HM Provence, because HM Provence was a ship that had to fit through the Suez Canal since they were going in the eastern route. So it was not going to be a gigantic ship. Anyway, what I really wanted what I really was hoping that the HMS Provence would be much more like the Campania and the Lucania, which was from like about 8, not even maybe 6 to 8 years later, and they were like proper ocean liners. But I think we were just slightly ahead of the time when there was an explosion of truly giant, luxurious ocean liners leading right up to the Titanic.
Yeah. Let's switch things up a little bit and talk about the idea of Sherlock and the appeal of the canon, and why you think readers gravitate to these books more than 100 years after they're written, why they are so appealing to writers, why they appeal to you.
I think readers are attracted. I mean, at the time, I think readers were attracted because it was like completely new. It was like nothing else that had come before. And And also, Sherlock Holmes is an iconoclast, right? He's not your typical Victorian gentleman. Like, he's a bachelor for one thing. He's not conforming to the very home and hearth ideals of the Victorian times. He's a bachelor. He's doing an unusual job, a job that would probably like get him strange looks in his own like social circle, because it is general consensus that he came from either the upper gentry or the lower aristocracy, or like the same stratum that Sherlock Holmes family at. So he's basically like a rule breaker, and he's like interesting in various ways. And he was also just so gosh darn good at what he did that you cannot help but be fascinated by the character. And people want to, when you want to read, you like that escape of reading people who are just like so good at what they're doing, and it just like sweep everything out of the way. And I think for me, the personal fascination is actually less with the canon as with the pastiche. Like, my favorite Sherlock Holmes works tend not to be the original canon stories, but more what other people have done with this character, with his characteristics, and with his way of detecting. And so, it's I find that to be fascinating, how each update brings its own innovation and originality, and building on this, a foundation like other people have built before. That's what fascinates me, the retelling, and the retelling for your own time, and retelling with your own twist of things.
Yes, the Sherlock character, this is a guess on my part, correct me if I'm wrong, make it easier for you as a writer because Sir Arthur Conan Doyle left a lot blank about his life. You can fill in details, you can take the character in different directions. It's not, I think Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was more interested in kind of the puzzle, the cleverness of that and solving that. So it lets you take the character and kind of ring new changes on it.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, there's so much about Sherlock Holmes's life that we don't know. We don't know his parents' name. I mean, do we? I'm not sure we do. And we don't even know, like, where he went to school. How we didn't know how old he was at the time he and Watson met. So we don't know. Basically, we don't know anything biographical about him, which is what like the 7% Solution, which is a famous Sherlock Holmes retelling published in the either in the late 70s or early 80s, and which I read about the same time I started reading the original canon. And that fascinated me even as a 12-year-old, because I was like, oh, so here in the original books, he's ingesting like he was just shooting himself up with cocaine, and that's just like, what, no big deal. And in the 7% Solution, it is like, oh, he was missing for 3 years because he was in rehab
yeah
in Switzerland or something like that. So it's like, I even as a very young kid, I loved what was done to like flesh out his biography.
Well, I think what you've done that's also rather smart with Charlotte is the original Sherlock Holmes, he can indulge in cocaine because he has an independent income. He doesn't have to worry about a job on a day-to-day level. But Charlotte, this is something that she relies on to support herself and her family. So she
Exactly.
has to have other forms of downtime, I guess. Or
That's right. Like a vice that is not going to conquer out on the couch.
Yes. How did you come up with giving her, we'll call it an addiction to sweets, so to speak?
Yeah, like a little sugar addiction. I don't know. It's possibly because the author herself very much enjoys a slice of cake from time to, and I used to have this tradition of like, I stopped because it could get too much. Like when I used to have one deadline a year, I would actually buy a cake for my deadline, and basically like replace 1 or 2 of my meals a day with just this cake. Like it's like a proper 4-layer, like maybe 10-inch cake that would take up half of one shelf of my, fridge. But I had to give that up when I kept having to have deadlines because my drafts keep not working out. And so I was like, what should she be obsessed with? How about some cake? Let her have all the cake that I can't have.
That's great.
But occasionally she also does have to watch out a bit, because I like did not want to make her the kind of woman who just eats all the cake in the world and like look exactly the same, because nobody does. Yeah.
Yeah, no, she has her own gauge of the number of chins as to when she needs to stop and go
Needs to
forward.
stop, yeah, like, or not to stop, but just like cut down a little bit, like not indulge as much as she would like to.
Let's talk a little bit about Moriarty, and your take on this character, because I think you're very perceptive in, at least for your books, Moriarty needs to be more of a presence. He needs to be part of the series, whereas for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he was more kind of on the sidelines, so to speak.
Yeah, and just like really brought out when he needed to kill off Sherlock Holmes,
Sherlock
right?
Holmes.
I read that somewhere that Moriarty only made like an appearance in 3 or at most 4 of the original canon stories, and there were a ton of them.
Mm-hmm. But for you, Moriarty
So,
is more important in your series. You want to develop him as a kind of an
part of that is
antagonist.
because also it's it I'm also reacting to the pop culture updates, like the Sherlock Holmes pastiche, because in the
Okay.
pastiche, Moriarty has become this arch enemy to Sherlock Holmes. So, and I was like, if you write a long series, it might not be bad to have an arch enemy, because that give you your protagonist needs some sort of like even more powerful antagonist to have something to struggle against. So yes, like I have, and also like I always complain about how the BBC Sherlock kind of went downhill after they got rid of their Moriarty in an episode I still fail to understand. So I was like, okay, I'm going to keep mine around for a little longer, so he'll like provide a foil to Charlotte for a little longer. But then it's a trick of like not making everything Moriarty related.
That's true. Let's talk a little bit about your writing process, because I find that fascinating, at least as a non-writer. You had a quote that you'd given someone else, and I'll read it. You said, writing a story is not like chiseling in marble. One mistake and your statue would be forever without an arm. It is much more like making pottery from clay. You can crunch the whole thing down and restart, and you can adjust as you go.
That's correct. I always say like words are the most abundant substance in the universe.
Yeah.
No matter how much you throw out, there's still like an endless supply of them where they came from. So yes, that is my view. I view the story as a very malleable thing, and I am not particularly attached to my words. I am much more interested in whether this execution of a story is any good. If I'm not taking the story in the right direction, or if I'm just not like executing the storyline the way it deserves it, like I will throw all the words out and restart. And in the end, I think it's just the story, the core idea that counts. If you can manage to get the core idea of the story across properly, then that's good. But still, I have to say, at this, like, the latest Sherlock books have been much less terrible to write than some of my earlier romances, when I was still learning how to, when I had no idea what story structure was and was just like, basically like stumbling around in the dark. So the earlier writing has really, and earlier trial by fires has really been like helped a lot in terms of writing these latest Sherlock books eventually.
That's great. Another thing that you had said, or kind of paraphrased, and I've heard other writers say it, is that there are only so many plots in fiction. The trick as a writer is characters. And I think that's true for your books, especially.
It is. I feel like you can always. I am still astonished by twists and turns. I feel like there's some twists and turns that are always good no matter what. Like the big example being Luke, I am your father. When Darth Vader did it in original episode, like in what was it? The Empire Strikes Back. It was like a shocking moment. And 20 some years later, in one of the Toy Stories, in one of the Toy Stories, I think some intergalactic evil lord said to Buzz Lightyear, "No, Buzz, I am your father." I just like laughed my head off, and again was astonished. Some plot twists are always good, and they are good because you're invested in the characters. They're good because you invent this character. You're like concerned about what happens to them, and you are worried about their emotional state. And that is when twists and plot developments work, because they are like impacting people you care about.
So as a writer, you have to know your characters in order to make the plot work.
Yes, very much so. And you have to like mystery is not necessarily a character driven, but then it also is very much a character driven, because it is the characters that commit murders and commit cover-ups and stuff like that. So in a sense it is plot driven, but in a sense it is also very, very much character driven.
Another thing that I find fascinating about writers is they're all individual. It's what I like to call their voice, or the way they tell the story. You have said that your voice did not really come to you until you'd written 1,000,000 words, and then you recognized your literary voice. How would you describe your writing, your literary voice, to someone who hasn't read you?
Interesting. I think my voice is not altogether the same when I write historical and when I write contemporary. I think when I write historical, and that is most of my work, has been some sort of it is a slightly arch voice. It is but it's also like, I think underneath that it is funny, because I've written, especially when I was writing romance, I used to, people used to call me a tearjerker. Say like I wrote a lot of tearjerkers. Yeah. But I feel like I think it comes out more in the Lady Sherlock books. It's a humorous voice, in the sense that I personally find a lot of things amusing. So that, and I feel like I am kindly disposed to most people, most small vices, most human foibles that human foibles that don't really hurt other people. That's like, things that fall short of true evil. I'm like, or true unkindness. I am kind of like kindly disposed toward it, and I think that comes across. Like there's a certain humor and a certain tolerance, and it's just like I feel like my mystery voice is more like me than my romance voice.
I think both your mysteries and your romances also share, there's kind of a luxurious quality to the writing. There's a richness to it that you sometimes don't find in other books. And also, I could be wrong, and this just could be my take, but I think you have a real love just for language and for
do.
words.
I very much do. And when I mean, readers may read a book only once, but the writers, they have to read it multiple times in all the iterations of revisions, and also like later the more technical stages of copy edits and page proofs. So I feel like I would be bored reading my own book if like there's not a little bit true to the prose. So it's almost as much for my own sake as it is for anything else, to have that little texture to the prose.
That's a great way of putting it. Let's take another turn and talk about you a little bit as a reader, because I know over the years you've read many different things. The last time we had a chance to talk, you were kind of indulging, and I'm going to get I won't even attempt the Chinese words for it, but they were like Chinese martial arts type novels.
Oh, I was mostly reading web novels, Chinese web novels. Yes, okay. I have since kind of like made a tentative return to reading in the English language.
Have you found any particular books that you loved over the last years or so, or is there something you're looking forward to as a reader?
The book I really loved was actually a fanfic that my
Oh,
friend recommended. It is this Harry Potter fanfic that is actually like a mashup between Harry Potter and The Handmaid's Tale, if you can believe it.
yeah.
So basically postulates that the good wizards lost the war,
Mhm.
and now Voldemort, who is in charge, is there's like problem with magical fertility, and so he's like matching captured witches from Harry Potter side to like his Death Eaters, and so basically it's a Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy coupling, and I hadn't read or thought much about Harry Potter for ages, but this book was so good. In a sense, it was like it's such a it's a war. It's a story about war. It's a love story, definitely, but it's also a story about war, and it's one of the best stories about war I've ever read. Although that may not be saying much because I don't choose to read stories about war normally, but this was a phenomenal piece of writing. It's called Manacled, and it's by Selin Yu, if anybody's interested. And I've also been reading, actually recommended by my editor. I've been reading the you guys must have this in your book, in your bookstore, because they've been selling very well lately. I've also been reading the Thursday Murder Club,
Yeah.
uh, and it's very interesting to then you realize how unusual it is to have older people as protagonists in stories. And then I've also just been like reading a lot of things having to do with food anthropology,
Oh,
which is like one of my favorite things to read about.
I didn't realize that. Is there a particular, I guess, is that like the history of food or what exactly?
It's yeah, it's history and social history of food. It's more like
Oh,
so for example, there will be it might be talking about, it might just be taking Twinkie and breaking down
oh,
each ingredient of the Twinkie. So that might be a contemporary one, and you might get a historical one, such as they they take a social history of like a drink or something like that, how it developed and what And I've also read a social history of fabrics, so that was also fascinating.
oh, that's interesting. If I remember correctly, you also at some point in the previous years discovered Dorothy Dunnett.
Oh my goodness, yes, yes. uh, I read the first book and it was an astonishing book. um, but I actually could not the but I she has passed on, hasn't she?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're
Yeah,
you're
I hate to speak. I hate to speak ill of anything because her books are astonishing, but her prose I find very, very dense. And
oh,
maybe I'm not sure how, because I think maybe some people might find my prose dense, but I find her prose dense. I find it like hard to get through. Like
mhm.
it's like it's a real exercise in my brain to actually understand what each sentence is saying.
Um, Now, in addition to, I think most of your books are traditionally published. Did you publish at least one book yourself, or maybe one
I
in some
have,
years?
yeah, I've actually published a couple of novel length books and a few short stories on my own. Yes, self-published. Yes.
What was that experience like for you? Because you pretty much have dealt with traditional publishers.
It's like it's very interesting in the sense that because I am not a self-publisher and I am not very good at it, so these books tend to be like just thrown
Fair enough.
thrown out. Like it's like tossing things into the sea of books out there, and they just promptly disappear. Unless people like just accidentally come across them. But these tend to be my favorite books
Oh.
because they're not under contract. And if you know me, you know I'm not like the most industrious of people. I like to do nothing. I really like doing nothing. So for me to like get off my behind or like sit on my behind and write these books for which nobody has promised me anything and for which I'm not obliged to handing a draft to anyone. they are like truly labors of love. Like they are there because I really want to write them. So my self-published ones are often my favorite books, like my contemporary romance, the one single contemporary romance I wrote, the prequel to My Beautiful Enemy. There's one called The Heart of the Universe, which is a science fiction romance. Those are all like books really dear near to my heart.
Yeah.
And commercially, I don't think they did much at all.
Well, I'm sure readers love them anyway. Before we run out of time, can you, if you're willing to, can you tell us what's next for you as a writer, or if you prefer to keep that secret?
What's coming up next for me is 2 more Lady Sherlock books. We just recently signed for books 8 and 9, and there is another book that in the contract. I'm not sure whether I'm at liberty to discuss it because I haven't asked my publisher. Like at first I thought they were going to offer me to do another historical romance, and I was rather looking forward to it, but they did not give me that book. They offered me a different book. So it will be something new. It will be something interesting, but yes, there will be 2 more, definitely 2 more, at least 2 more Lady Sherlock books, and there will be this new thing in the next couple of years.
Wow.
For which I am doing research now, and for which I am wondering, like, why me? Frankly.
Well, that's so mysterious.
Like, what is it about me that you make my publisher think I should be writing this? Like, okay, but I have never refused money when it comes to just like, if you want me to write something, offer me sufficient amount of money and I will write it.
That's a very pragmatic approach. And how can readers learn more about you and your books? You have a website? Are you on social media?
Yes, I have 2 websites. You can find me at sherrythomas.com, or you can find the Lady Sherlock books at ladysherlockbooks.com. They have a site devoted to them. And you can find me, I am Sherry Thomas on Twitter, author Sherry Thomas on Facebook, and I think writer Sherry Thomas on Instagram. And I'm not very good at social media, so don't expect a whole lot of fun or engaging stuff from me. It's usually there when I feel like I must post something, lest everybody think I have, something happened to me.
No longer with us. Yeah. Well, I can't believe how quickly our time has flown by. It's just been an absolute delight having Sherry Thomas here talking about her new Lady Sherlock book.
As always, yes.
A
Thank you so
Tempest
much for having me.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone for tuning into another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore.